I love it when I'm right. Although I got to admit, sometimes I get frustrated that it took the rest of the world so long to come around.
Jeez, because it's difficult being so far ahead of everyone.
Well, yeah, it's frustrating.
You're
over here, the truth. It's right here, the truth. And the rest of America's walking around saying, I don't know where to go.
So you like being right, but
yes.
it's your cross to bear.
Yes,
that other people aren't as wise as you.
Finally, somebody who understands me.
It must be awful.
That's exactly right. So this is an article from the New York Times, and this is what I referred to just before the top of the hour. This might be the biggest, ugliest, most damaging bit of political correctness that's existed in the last 50 years. Patricia Cohen has written this piece in the Times. I'm going to share some of it with you. For more than 40 years, social scientists investigating the causes of poverty have tended to treat cultural explanations, i.e., the way people act and live, like Lord Voldemort, that which must not be named. It's a legacy of ugly battles that erupted after Daniel Patrick Moynihan, then Assistant Labor Secretary in the Johnson administration, introduced the idea of a culture of poverty in a startling 1965 report. Although Moynihan didn't coin that phrase, his description of the urban black family is caught in an inescapable tangle of pathology. Unmarried mothers, welfare dependency, was seen as attributing self-perpetuating moral deficiencies to black people as if blaming them for their own misfortune. Moynihan got murdered for, quote, blaming the victim.
I didn't know that.
And his analysis never lost its appeal to conservative thinkers, and Bill Clinton actually, in a very significant way, came around. But in the this is the New York Times. But in the overwhelmingly liberal ranks of academic sociology and anthropology, the word culture became a live grenade, and the idea that attitudes and behavior patterns kept people poor was shunned. Now, after decades of silence, academia wouldn't even discuss the idea. These scholars are speaking openly about you-know-what, conceding that culture and persistent poverty are enmeshed. Said Douglas Massey, a sociologist at Princeton, who's argued that Moynihan was unfairly maligned. I've actually heard of that guy, which is odd. Quote, we've finally reached the stage where people aren't afraid of being politically incorrect. And this is 45 years later? 45 years of government policy and alleged programs to help the poor, and now and by the way, we're going to talk to the Heritage Foundation about this tomorrow. More people than ever before are dependent on the government in the United States right now to horrifying levels. Last month, Princeton and the Brookings Institution released a collection of papers on unmarried parents, a subject it noted that became off limits after the Moynihan report and the lash back.
Moynihan, a Democrat, by the way.
Right. Oh, yeah. And a very, very smart guy. But
even he could not say there's a culture of poverty and get away with it.
Academia wouldn't even consider the effect of unmarried partners and it goes beyond being unmarried, but a complete lack of interest in intact families. At a recent annual meeting of the American Sociological Association, attendees discussed the resurgence of scholarship on culture. And in Washington last spring, social scientists participated in a congressional briefing on culture and poverty. Culture is back on the poverty research agenda, the introduction declares, acknowledging that it never should have been removed. More on this, including some unbelievable statistics and some people saying some things that you, I have a feeling, thought, well, yes, of course. Well, virtually for your whole life, but they weren't even allowed to say and have people disagree with them. You couldn't say it.
That is
like
really
saying, I'd like to have
interesting.
sex with your child. It was just off limits.
That's really interesting.
God dang it makes me crazy how willing people are to ignore what they see because it makes them feel uncomfortable. So this academia that studies poverty and social programs, etc., for the last 45 years has acknowledged we kind of considered it completely out of bounds to talk about culture and the way people behave, which is it borders on insanity, doesn't it? To talk about the way people live and the decisions they make and how that would influence their poverty. It's astounding to me. You know, feelings are wonderful. They're good. They make life worth living. We don't want to be mindless drones going around like machines. It's our the beauty of life that makes it worth living. But at the same time, the idea that, well, you're blaming the victim. Every effective, efficiently functioning organization I've ever seen, from the most incredibly functional to, the submarine my brother served on, to various good businesses and sports teams and whatever. The question of blaming a victim, it's a ridiculous notion. What you do is you try to figure out what happened, what caused it, and what is the best solution for it. The idea of you're going to hurt somebody's feelings means you don't want to talk about it, or that's nasty, or that's mean, so you don't want to. Unbelievable.
So they wanted to do a study on why some people end up poor, but they didn't want to include decisions that they make,
their lifestyle and cultural norms in their community,
which would be
patterns of behavior,
which would be decisions that you make.
Right, exactly.
So it's what I'm always talking about. It had to be something from the outside that happened to them.
Right,
everybody's
exactly.
doing their level best, making brilliant decisions. It's just a system that kept them from saving their money or whatever,
or getting married, or teaching their kids the value of education whatsoever, or so on and so forth. So the New York Times has said, academia has admitted for the past 45 years they've ignored culture in the persistence of poverty, particularly in some communities and among various ethnic groups.
Well, there are more poor white people than there are anybody else.
Right. Today, social scientists are rejecting the notion of a monolithic and unchanging culture of poverty. Then they attribute destructive attitudes and behavior not to inherent moral character, but to sustained racism and isolation. So they're saying, yes, it exists, but it's white people's fault. Well, at least that's progress. Robert Sampson, a sociologist at Harvard, culture is best understood as shared understandings.
And one of the understandings in some of those cultures is you can't get ahead, so don't try.
Right, exactly, which is white people's fault, according to the current thinking. But again, at least they're getting a little closer. Now,
is it white people's fault for all the poor white people?
Yes. As a part of a large research project in Chicago, Robert J. Sampson, a sociologist at Harvard, who's talking about shared understandings, he walked through different neighborhoods this summer, dropping stamped, addressed envelopes to see how many people would pick up apparently lost letter and mail it, a sign that looking out for others is part of the community's culture. Some neighborhoods, like Grand Boulevard, where the notorious Robert Taylor public housing projects once stood, almost no envelopes were mailed. In other neighborhoods, researchers received more than half the letters back. Income levels didn't necessarily explain the difference, but rather the community's cultural norms, the levels of moral cynicism and disorder. William Julius Wilson, whose pioneering work boldly confronted ghetto life while focusing on economic explanations for persistent poverty, defined culture as the way individuals in a community develop an understanding of how the world works and makes decisions based on that understanding. Right. And you weren't allowed to talk about that for almost half a century. For some young black men, Professor Wilson, a Harvard sociologist, said, the world works like this. If you don't develop a tough demeanor, you won't survive. If you have access to weapons, you get them. And if you get into a fight, you use them. Right. It might almost be helpful if these people would focus on poor white people. Just because the whole racial thing, everybody gets their back up.
Yeah, exactly. So
starts talking about racism. Talk about white people who believe there's no use trying because you can't get ahead.
Go into the South, and find large groups of white people, and then, maybe that would be easier.
Yeah. This is unbelievable. Academia finally admitting, for 50 years we didn't talk about this because we didn't, it was politically incorrect, literally. You couldn't bring it up or you'd get drummed out of the field.
Where did you come across this article?
It's the New York Times.
I'm going to have to read that.
Yeah, it is. There's more to it.
Hey, Scott.
Still, I'm sorry, one more note, just because I don't want to leave you feeling happy and positive. Still, worries about blaming the victim persist. Policymakers and the public still tend to view poverty through one of two competing lenses. Are the poor poor because they are lazy, or are the poor poor because they are victims of the markets?
Those are the only two choices?
Exactly. Stupid versus idiots.
Welcome to the Armstrong and Getty Show.
Let's take this call. Why not? Lucas in Rockland wants to talk about culture is back to being a factor discussed in terms of poverty. For 50 years, you weren't allowed to. Hello, Lucas.
Hey, guys.
What's up?
So Jack made the point that the researchers should really just focus on, or not should, but it would be helpful if they focused on poor white people, because then they could talk about culture and not not run the risk of being accused of being a racist.
Yes.
But I think they have an odd conundrum here, because I think at the heart of most of these academics, or this type of academic that we're talking about, they don't care about poor white people. The people that they feel compassion about, the groups they feel compassion about, are the other ethnic groups. Mm-hmm. And so those are the people they want to focus on when they talk about poverty. We know that, when an academic, speaks about poverty, what they're really talking about are these other ethnic groups.
Yeah, usually, and Lucas, thanks for the call. I'm afraid we're really pressed for time. Yeah, you almost always see him looking at the inner city, the ghetto, not poor white people.
I don't think I've ever seen a report where they even touched on the idea of how many people there are below the poverty line that are white.
And I don't particularly care what color
I don't
you
either.
are.
I don't either, but it's
how to cure the problem. That's my only concern.
It's pretty interesting. All right, stay with us.